I want to begin with the following short excerpt from Robert Frost's 1916 poem, Mending Wall. There where it is, we do not need the wall. He is all pine and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. I begin my address to you with these familiar words in order for us to begin to think collectively about what it means to be in a relationship to one another, to form community, what it is that walls us in or walls us out. If the standard definition of empathy is, quote, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another, to feel with as opposed to for another, as when we sympathize, what forms the basis for such an understanding and prompts the willingness to share the feelings of others, to absorb rather than only observe? It seems to me that the answers to these questions are to be found somewhere in the order of belonging. Today, what brings us together is the start of a new academic year, our community, Scripps College, our playground, our classrooms, girded by gates, traversed by welcoming, enclosed rectangles of lawn. When I think of my first playgrounds, it may surprise you to know that I think of Haiti, of Port-au-Prince, the city of my birth. I remember wide open spaces from preschool. I see myself happy, smiling, unencumbered by the realities of a tragic politics of a time as a violent dictatorship reigned. And the picture you see behind me is one I took when I was 8 years old. I was protected, my innocence untouched. I imagine that most of us here probably have similar early memories of protection and comfort. We might even be surprised at how similar our yards may have been, whether we were born or raised in Europe, the Middle East, Latin America, Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, North America. Yards with sand pits, swings or slides, climbing gyms, places to run, dirt or lawns, benches, perhaps like these. Playgrounds and childhoods are more alike than they are different, but we might also remember times when we were on the outside looking in, some yards beyond us, or some groupings within them out of reach, making the yard space seem more like the following. Right now, I'd like each of you to think back for a moment to a yard from your own childhood or culture. Really imagine its details, what it looked, felt, or smelt like, who was there with you or not with you, and for 45 seconds, in silence, I'd like you to fully imagine yourself back in that space. Now, 45 seconds during a talk aimed to launch you confidently in the adventures of a new year may have seemed like a waste of time for some, while for others, it may have provided a space of stillness and contemplation, a temporary relief from the rush of a morning. I hope that for most, you were able to remember a safe space from the past. 45 seconds is all it took to destroy such sites of memory from my own childhood. 45 seconds is all it took to wipe out over 200,000 people from the face of this earth and render another 1.25 million homeless, if they were not already destitute. It is the length of time it took for the second deadliest earthquake to take place on January 12, 2010 in Port-au-Prince, an earthquake from which most Haitians are still recovering. For the record, the first deadliest earthquake took place in China in the 1500s. But there are other kinds of earthquakes in different parts of the world, some ongoing, the product of vestiges of history and man-made institutions that continue to erode the terrain beneath the ground of countless people and cultures who have been deemed less worthy of their humanity. Take, for instance, the ongoing issue of police brutality towards people of color, especially of African descent in the US today. The diversity of opinion on what, if anything, should be done about this state of affairs seems to have almost everything to do with the yard you live in, the world you inhabit, that is, as defined by class and race, and sometimes by gender. When I proposed my 2014 Guggenheim Awarded project on African diasporic artists and writers, I struggled with how to explain what I was attempting to do until I realized I was developing a bridge between discrete realities, one that I hoped would also, in the process, valorize, validate, and foreground the realities, aesthetics, politics, and philosophies of people of African descent from across the globe. I drew my model from the Afro-Caribbean concept of a yard, what in Haiti is called the LAKOU, a gathering space for spiritual and cultural exchange, patterned after the traditional yards of African villages that serve to assemble those of the same family lineage and eventually group kinship circles. In the Americas, the LAKOU, or yard, is a place of remembrance and gathering that serves as a unique space to consolidate survival transhistorically. At this time, like many diasporic spaces, the yard, or LAKOU, has become virtual rather than physical, but I argue it remains a space for cultural inspiration and identity consolidation. The idea then was to change how people think of those they deem others, in this case people of African descent, by centering the African perspective, to ask the question, what does the world look like seen from another perspective? Empathy as a transformative agent, I believe, begins with being able to commit to the process of answering this question, as it necessarily leads to the understanding that can break down barriers and walls. This is a question I found partially answered at the Architectural Biennale in Venice, Italy this summer, reporting from the front, curated by Colombian architect Alejandro Aravena, whose call asked participants to keep in mind that, quote, architecture is about giving form to the places where we live, but also that the form of those places are the consequences of regulations, interests, economies, and policies, or perhaps even of a lack of coordination and difference and simple chance. The forms these places assume may improve or ruin people's lives, unquote. Aravena called on participants to reimagine the role of the organization of space as having socio-political force. I will give you a glimpse of only 2 responses to his invitation today that suggest new ways of creating understanding through the organization of space. The first comes from Western Sahara, a collaboration between the architectural firm Manuel Hirst and the National Union of Sahrawi Women. The Sahrawi are nomadic Berbers, many of whom reside in some of the longest existing refugee camps in the world, made of tents and mud, established in 1975 in Algeria as the result of war and remaining in use some 41 years later. Within the tent, which serves as the installation space, were hung weavings by the women, one showing the routes of their dispersion throughout the Sahara, across Morocco, Mauritania, and Algeria, and another a map of their daily routes in the camps for schooling, water, gatherings, health. The tent, gray and drab, was approached by few, but once entered revealed a world, a nationless nation, one without true borders. But one had to be willing to enter the tent to discover this reality. The Dutch pavilion, on the other hand, a main attraction, also held a surprise. Entitled Blue, it presented a scathing critique of the architecture of UN peacekeeping missions and focused on the Dutch UN forces in Gao, Mali, contrasting the blue people, the Tuareg, with the blue helmets of the peacekeeping UN forces, to suggest that the UN, quote, should become a catalyst for local development and empower the local community to reconstruct their environment themselves, unquote, rather than, as they do presently, focus primarily on defense while imposing themselves on the landscape and local people. The architects involved in the project discovered in the process that the Dutch had already borrowed extensively from African forms and transposed them to the Netherlands through the early 20th century. Architect Aldo van Eyck, for instance, transposed the nomadic circular architecture of nomadic tribes encountered in Mali, especially the Dogon and Talem, to playground design in Amsterdam. In the pavilion, the architects reconstituted the structure, filled it with sand, and made it their centerpiece to suggest that the open circle could operate as a gathering space in Malian UN compounds that would welcome rather than keep out locals. Circles suggest expansion, inclusion, shared space. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the predominance of this form and the absence of walls, the principal architects of such structures in sub-Saharan nomadic groups are women. To return now where I began 6 years on, the UN has finally admitted responsibility for a cholera outbreak provoked by a Nepalese UN contingent in Haiti that disposed of their waste improperly in Haiti's largest river, killing an additional 9,200 people after the earthquake and infecting a great many others over the last several years. As the Dutch pavilion in Venice suggests, if the UN could and can begin to reform itself to relate to local space as shared space with shared consequences, accountability, and solutions, then perhaps others can as well. But despite some of our best efforts, we live in a world in which the goal of being able to assume a shared sense of community based on empathy and thus a sense of shared humanity is most often aspirational. I imagine, however, that we who are gathered here today, whether students, faculty, administrators, or staff, believe in what brings us together, the hope and possibility that the educational process can uncover. Each day we step onto campus is a day in which we step into a circle of possibility. As we enter into this new academic year, let us consider that our yards here are spaces in which we can come together, not to erase differences, but to better understand them. In the interest of forging community, let us begin to broaden our circles, not wall in or wall out, to make use of silence to contemplate rather than to suppress, to formulate questions rather than ready-made answers. It takes a great deal longer to build a new reality than to tear one down. In 45 seconds, anyone's world can be torn apart, but memory outlives even devastation. As such, I wish you a year of discovery, of reaching beyond your comfort zones to discover coexisting worlds that will enrich and expand your own, and through their better understanding, provide you with a skill to share in the lives of others so as to forge a better and stronger sense of community in all of the spaces you may inhabit. Thank you.